Bava Metzia, page 28. We'll start today on page 27, 11 lines from the bottom of the page. I want to take this opportunity to thank all the people who email me, send me the comments, phone calls, colleagues, and more. Thank you, and please keep up the good work and keep contacting me and brings all your points and ideas. It's really להגדיל תורה ולהאדירה, it's beautiful. The idea of סימנים מובהקים, when we have a distinguishing mark, if that's a rabbinic or biblical, it's the subject of today, core subject of today. But there are much more ideas and halachic point that we can derive from the shiur, from the lesson, the daf of today. There is a responsa called Chacham Tzvi, great rabbi of the past generation. At that time, it was the issue of releasing a aguna, a wife that the husband was in a state of disappearance, and based on what we study in the previous daf and other sources, the question is, can we depend upon certain distinguishing mark, but they are not called muvhakim, such as recognition of clothing that he wear, that people recognize, part of his face and things like that. But before we go there, the key question is the whole idea of returning an item that's lost. Let's speak in a very basic way. A fellow walking a public domain, and all of a sudden there is a bunch of money, bunch of cash. And let's say if it was a public domain or department store or retail store, who is the owner of that money? But part of that discussion is the idea, since the Torah requires us in the commandment, in the precept, to return an item, the whole notion of what we learn, the distinguishing marks, which is the simanim, the idea that we're just using a name, Reuven is the one who discovered an item, and Shimon claimed that he is the owner. The notion of having Shimon give Reuven certain distinguishing mark, certain simanim, is that biblical? Is that something that we derive clearly from the biblical, from the Torah text, or is it a rabbinic precept, rabbinic enactment? In the ancient time, when we have the Holy Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Yerushalayim, it was a place called Even HaToen. At that time, and you see it recorded in the lot of oral teaching text in the Mishnah and the Talmud, people who lost and found, people who discovered items, and especially valuable items, they stood up in that specific location and proclaim and announce, this is I found something, and other people came in. So the question is, how long one needs to do it, and how far one needs to travel to do that proclamation, and much more. So the whole notion of mitzvat hashavat avedah, returning an item, and what we learned so far, that needs to have some recognition of distinguishing mark in order for the recipient to receive it, we have an upcoming discussion if it's based on rabbinic or Torah. Amar Rabba, again, page 27b, 11 lines from the bottom of the page. Amar Rabba, Rava said, Im timtzei lomar, mach simanim lav deoraita. If you tell me that the whole point of distinguishing mark and returning an item, which we call simanim, it's not biblical, it's only rabbinic enactment, heichei mehadrinan aveideta besimanim. How come we say that returning an item, we should do it based on the distinguishing mark? What exactly the notion of our holy sages to put such an enactment, a requirement to have a lost item returned by those distinguishing marks? Why? Because the one who proclaimed it, one who announced it, he just said, I found something. The other one is the one who said, oh, it's mine and it carries so and so. So the mindset, it has to be, it's biblical. So the Gemara said, "Denichal lemotze aveda, denehedar besimanim, ki heiche dechi avda lei ledidei, nam nehadu lei besimanim." The idea is that Reuven, let's use name, he is the one who discovered a valuable item. And now he comes out and he said, I discover a valuable item, and if you give me a certain distinguishing marks, I'm going to return to you, let's say Shimon. So in a way, Reuven is a convenience for him because psychologically he's thinking in the back of his mind, if I, Reuven, let's say, tomorrow I will be the one who lost an item, then I'll be very comfortable to go back and say, oh, so and so and so are distinguishing mark, and someone else will return. So the way is like, the way I want to have others treated me, I'm going to treat them, and therefore that's the mechanism, the mindset of the one who found it, and that's a convenience for him to go by that point of distinguishing mark, and therefore that's the rabbinic enactment based on our Torah precept. אמר לרב ספא לרבא, וכי אדם עושה טובה לעצמו בממון שאינו שלו? What type of business is this? That Reuven discovered an item that is not his, he's not the owner at this point for sure, because he's coming out and declare, this is an item that I found, and I want to see if I can find someone who's the owner. So, can Reuven does any type of business matters with the item that is not the owner? Why do we care what exactly Reuven, the item, the one who found the item, have in mind? The whole notion is you go by the one who lost the item, because he's the owner who just lost the item. Let's use the word Shimon, meaning the whole idea is we have to think of Shimon who's dying to have the item that he lost back to him. אלא ניחא ליה לבעל הוועידה למאהב סימנים ולמשקלי. The mindset is, and see how ingenious is our ancient rabbis to this very day, that they get to the mindset that the Shimon, we use a name, that he is the one who lost the item and can be broken-hearted or can be very hard to cope with the valuable item that he lost. So it's a convenience matter for him to bring out the distinguishing mark, and therefore he get it back because because if you really examine him, if you testify him, he doesn't have many times witnesses that say that this valuable item, it's mine, it's Shimon. He doesn't have that. So therefore, he has a real concern. Umeimar amar, he will say to himself, Kulei alma layadei simanim muvakim dida. Most of the world doesn't know a very clear, good, distinguishing mark that I know. Now, Tosfot here comments on a very important point. He said, doesn't mean mamash muvhakim, meaning we're not talking about something that is a crystal clear, lucidly belongs to Shimon. We are talking about something that is in a way yoter tovim. They have a better quality or better description than anybody else will come out. So the potential owner or the original owner of that lost item can describe length, weight, width, all kind of things that bring it in a little advanced point than anyone else. ואנה יהיבנה סימונים מובהקים דידה ושקר ליה. So as Tosfot explained, because I have this advantage, I lost an item, and I have the description that comes out with the item, so therefore, we have this rabbinic enactment that said that we should count on those distinguishing marks, and therefore, he can get it back. Otherwise, potentially, he said, I don't have any witness, and I can lose the item at all. So it's better to go in this way. So in other words, that's the balance of the mindset, the one who lost. The great Rabbi Landau, the Noda Yehuda, the great posek, the great rabbi in the old day Czechoslovakia, as well as Rabbi Akiva Eiger, they both in the Tractate Chulin and other places have a discussion based on this Gemara. If you have two witnesses that came out and said, this fellow, we saw him as a murderer. We saw that person that is a serious violation and more. Yet they do not know the person in a sense of knowing that person. The only recognition is distinguishing mark by, let's say, heights and more. So is that bring the point of simanim deoraita? Based on that, we say that those people who testified can go ahead and say that that's enough to say it's height, to call it biblical, and especially if you talk about a potential capital punishment or anything in that fashion, is that sufficient? In other words, do you require the witnesses to know the person in order to go the next level of testimony or not? Based on our Gemara, they expand on that. So now the Gemara challenged what Rabba's point of view, as we said earlier, that the one who lost the item, you just use the name Shimon, is much comfortable, convenience for him to return the item based on those distinguishing marks, because he loses nothing out of that. Hadetnan, you reflect on something that we discussed earlier on page 20, and over there is a notion that brings the whole idea of simanim de Rabbanan, the distinguishing mark based on rabbinic enactment. And how is that? So the scenario is if one discover a three note or three documents. In those days it can be a court document or loan document or notes, and those carries name of a borrower that borrow from three lenders. So let's use the name. Let's say Yaakov, he borrowed from Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. So the Pnei Yoshua and Rabbi Akiva Eiger and others have a discussion, the whole mindset now. Why you don't say Bari B'Shema Bari Adif, which means if you have something that is substantially and tangibly clear and something that is not clear, you have the one who found the item that it's clear, we have it lefaneinu, and we have Shema, we have quandary, you're not so sure if it's clear or not. So the notion that Neoshua and Rabbi Akiva Eiger explained, the Motzeh HaAveda, Reuven, who discovered the item, he is in a way Shomer, he is the guardian for the one who lost to Baal Aveda. So it's like a pikadon, it's like an item that is in a guard, in a saving for the fellow that lost it. So therefore, you cannot say Bari B'Shema because it's Bari and Bari. It means it's clear in both. And as long as it's not bring Re'ayah, clear proof that it's someone else, so therefore, Simanim de Rabbanan. So anyway, אלא דתנן רבן שמעון גמליאל אומר אחד הלווה משלושה יחזיר ללווה. So as we said, Yaakov, he is the borrower from three different institutions, from Reuven, from Shimon, from Levi, and therefore, since there are three documents that put the name of Yaakov as the borrower, יחזיר ללווה, he needs to return it to יעקב, versus שלושה שלוו מן האחד. But if you have three borrowers that borrow from one lender, so therefore יחזיר למלווה, he return all these documents to the lender. So the question is, ניחא לי ללווה להדורי לי למלווה. So it means you're going to tell me that the borrower is comfortable of returning those documents to the lender? For sure not. Because the great concern we have here is that the lender can abuse it, as Rashi explained, and recharge double dip, right, to the fellow that maybe already paid him. So Rabbi explained, Amar Lei, Rabbi explained to Rav Safra, Hatam over there, Mistabra, you have a logical reasoning to say that when we speak about the three documents, Svarahu, so we think logically that the first scenario return those documents to the borrower, and the second scenario, as we said, we bring it to the lender, even it's not carry any simanim, any distinguishing mark. The reason for that, it's because אחד הלווה משלושה יחזיר ללווה, דגבי לווה שכיחי, גבי מלווה לא שכיחי. So the three separate documents of one name, let's say Yaakov, that's very common that they are in the possession of the borrower. But it's very unlikely to find in the possession of one lender, since there are three lenders. Why one lender carry the three separate documents? It's very illogical, irrational to think that way. Shma mina milovenaful. Logically, you have to say that it's a fall from what? From the one who borrowed. And therefore, that's the reason you return it to him. Vice versa. Shlosha shelavu me'echad. If you have three separate borrowers that borrow from one institution or one person, so the correct version is the yachazir, yachazir meaning return it, lamalve, to the lender, דגבי מלווה שכיחי, גבי לווה לא שכיחי. The same logical reasoning, just the opposite way, because it's very common that the whole three documents are in the possession of the lender. It's very unlikely that the whole three borrowing statements are by the possession of the borrower, because there are three separate borrowers. So how all of them all of a sudden in the possession of one borrower? So what do you derive from that? The whole idea of returning those documentation, in this case to the lender, it's not because he carries a distinguishing mark, but it's only because it's mistabra, it's a logical reasoning to understand that all of them basically came out of his possession. So therefore, we do not need the consent of the borrower. Based on that, there is a responsa from one of the giant rabbi of the past generation, the responsa Chacham Tzvi. He discussed a case of a person that lost, meaning the wife married to the man, and all of a sudden, it's a long period of time, and he just disappeared. And all of a sudden, they discover a body. So based on our discussion, it was two separate distinguishing marks, two simanim, but they are not in such a level of muvhakim that you can go by them, such as one was part of the head, and the other one is part of the clothing that some people recognize. So, because it's a fake aginu, because it's the real painful subject of potential having her stuck in that framework of marriage and be a deserted wife, since it's not clear that it is her husband. So the problem is part of the hand is not considering siman muvhak, as we discussed in Yevamot. And the clothing, you can argue and you can say that it's maybe borrowed, maybe the body of the deceased borrowed those clothing from the one who disappeared. So the Chacham Tzvi come here with novelty, with a big chidush, and he says, yes, even each item of the two are not siman mubhak, are not definitely distinguishing mark, but if you combine these two together, he says you can have a heter aguna, we can allow that woman to go ahead and marry someone else based on shnei hasimanim beyachad, based on those two that we collected together. And that was a big chidush based on our Gemara. Page 28, Ela hadetnan. Now we're referring to something we learn on page 20, both 28 and 20b. מצא תכריך של שטרות או אגודה של שטרות, הרי זה יחזיר. So here a situation that one discover either several, let's say 3 bills together, let's say $300 together, or it's wrapped like some type of bundle together. So the point is, he needs to return it to a fellow that gives the amount of those bills. And the most important part, as we learn on page 20b, is if he discovers how he wrapped those bills and the amount, you have to return. So you mean to say that here it's befitting for the borrower that return to the lender by those distinguishing marks. So therefore, he rejected the notion of distinguished mark is a rabbinic enactment and bring a source from the Torah to that important din hasimanim, the importance of distinguishing mark. אלא מרבה סימנים דאורייתא דכתיב והיה עמך עד ראש אחיך אותו. The proof that distinguishing mark are biblical is from the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 22, verse 2. The Torah said, it should, I paraphrase the word of the Torah, it should stay with you, meaning the one who discovered that valuable, it should stay by you until you, fellow brethren, will come and request it, inquire. So the question is, you mean to say that the one, let's use the name Reuven, who discovered a valuable item, for example, so he is going to give it to the one who claimed that he lost, Shimon, before Shimon come out and say that he lost? For sure not. So therefore, since Reuven does not know in this case Shimon, so Ela darsheu im ramaihu or eino ramai. So therefore, you have to make a special inquiry to make sure that the guy is not a thief or a cheater that basically try to take advantage of the situation of you and just lie over the distinguishing mark. And therefore, lav besimanim. What is the derivative when the Torah said it should stay by Reuven until Shimon come and requested? For sure, the Torah alluded indirectly to say that you need to have Shimon come up with a clear distinguishing mark in order for him to have it bank. Shma mina, so you derive from here that simanim deoraita, that those distinguishing marks are biblical. Now the question is, the rabbi tells us that we learned in the previous daf, in 27b, that because the Ritva explained that we do not explain that reason for the rabbinic enactment, so you have to say that it's biblical. But the early Mefarshim, the early Rishonim, Rabbeinu Asher, and others expand on that. In general, the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, asked a question: if you tell me that simanim lav d'oraita, distinguishing mark, are not biblical, so why you need to return tachrich shel shtarot, a bundle of bill? So the Rosh explained, you can go and say that we talk about Talmid Chacham, Torah scholar, as we learned in the past, that we take his tviut ayin, we take his words. So therefore, if a person discover a bundle, chavilat shtarot, a bundle of bills, and the problem is if the lender is a Talmid Chacham, and you go by the tviut ayin, by the one that he distinguishing it, by recognizing it, and he claimed that it's his, in order to do hotzaat mamon me'acher, in order to inquire a money from another person, can you depend on that Talmid Chacham? If you go by the Rosh, it's yes, not everyone agrees. Amar Rabba, im timtze lomar simanim d'oraita, if you tell me that distinguishing marks are biblical, im timtze lomar hapashit le simanim d'oraita. What do you mean it's obvious? Rabbi explained and said that it's biblical. And here it means that it's maybe a dilemma, maybe it's not clear. So the Gemara said it's not total proof. Why? Mishum de'ika lemeimar kideshaninan. As we said earlier, that you go by the witnesses and not by the distinguishing mark, as we learn on page 27b. So Rabbah continued his statement and he said, simanim v'simanim yaniach. If two people come and said, I lost this item, and bring distinguishing mark, and each of them come up and say those points that looks about the same. So if they're not going for some type of compromise, you have to leave it alone, as the Rambam in Ilchot Gzela V'Avilah, chapter 13 said, until the end of the day, Ad Sheyavo Eliyahu. Rabbi Akiva Eiger asked, based on that Rashi in the Rambam, he said, what do we learn? Shnayim ochazim b'talit. If you have two people that hold the garment, yachloku. So over there, he tried to say Rabbi Akiva Eiger that it's a muchazakim. Kan, here, shomer motze leba'al abedai. You can argue and you say that the one who discovered the lost item, he is kind of guardian that's saving it for the real fellow that lost it. So therefore, that's the idea of yaniach. Simanim ve'edim yinatem le'ba'al ha'edim. So as we said several times, that if you have a choice between witnesses versus a distinguishing mark, you always go by the witnesses. Even if you tell me that simanim de'oraita, so the Gemara said, simanim ve'simanim, ed echad keman deleite dame ve'yaniach. So if one fellow brings the distinguishing mark, and the other one brings distinguishing mark, but he brings one witness that claimed that that's his item, so therefore, one witnesses we learn several times in the Torah that al pi shnei edim, you have to have two. And based on the Torah statement in Dvarim, chapter 19, verse 15, when it's come to money, one witness is not take as a point of trust, but therefore There are those, the Rabbi Moshe said that you need to take a special oath and testimony. The big Ran, the well-known Ran in Chulin, which I didn't want to go there, but the Ran in Chulin have a big discussion over Amma Aretz B'Tviut Ayin, if you go by the one who's not a Torah scholar. So he said that yes, the difference is that Talmid Chacham, we assume that he will be truthful. The Amma Aretz, we're afraid that he was not. So when it's come to his item, we're afraid that he will not be truthful. But for someone else, yes, based on Hugmara, what's the purpose of saying Yaniach based on that Ran in Chulin? The Avnei Nezer hold that Tviut Ayin, it's even if one claim that he recognizes it and the other one opposes it, so therefore you have to do your very best due diligence. But that's the idea of Yaniach. When you're not sure, you don't want the person who's not really, in a way, clearly deserve to be the owner of this property, of this item, to receive it. But anyway, there's much more in that Avnei Nezer and the Ran in Chulin based on our Gemara. Now, Edei Ariga ve'edei Nefila tinaten le'edei Nefila. So one brings witnesses that say that he is the one who put together that piece of clothing. The others bring two witnesses that say that they saw that garment, that clothing fell from him. So you go by the second. Why? We said it can be a situation that one who put together that piece of clothing, he sold it to someone else, and the other fellow is the one who lost it, which is the one who purchased it. So even if Reuven, let's say, have witnesses that he's the one who put together that piece of clothing, that's still, according to Shita Mekubetzet and others, not sufficient. Midat orko umidat rochbo. One brings the length and one brings the width, right? Tinaten lemidat orko. You give it to the one who will bring the length of the garment. The midat rochbo, that the regular clothing, shiurei kameshar. You can basically estimate it. You can assume certain kad mechasa lemara b'kaya. So when a person, the owner, stand there and cover himself with that garment, umidat orko lo mishtayale, because that's take the talit. So you need to open it and open it totally and put it all the way down. So therefore, the assumption is that the length, it's hard or close to impossible to recognize. That Sma in Choshen Mishpat 267 expand to that. The Shach, there is a very important Shulchan Aruch Harav by the end of the Shulchan Aruch Harav and Mishnah Brura on this subject of Talit, Midat Orko, Midat Rochbo. So, Midat Gamav, Rashi here said, Ga'am Yevanit Asuya Kemin Kaf Sofit Shelanu. So Rashi here tells us that Gama, it's similar to the Kaf Sofit, the letter Kaf Sofit. That's a description in the sense of length and width. So they said, Yinaten lemidat orko verochbo, because that's a better distinguishing mark. Midat orko, midat rochbo, midat mishkelotav. If someone brings the length, the width, another fellow brings the weight, Yinaten lemidat mishkelotav. You give it to one who brings the weight, because weight is considering a better siman muvhak, a better distinguishing mark, because usually people do not weight garments. If you remember, we studied on page 23b in Tosfot there. The Baal Tanya in Shulchan Aruch Harav, he wrote to Rabbi Yitzchak ben Barditcher, the Senegorav Shel Israel in the Kedushat Levi. he bring a case based on Gemara, a case of Aguna, a woman that they cannot discover where is their husband, and they found two simanim benoniyim, two distinguishing marks, but they are not sufficient in a sense to declare that this is the man that lost. Obviously that was way before DNA or things like that. So there is a Shelot v'tshuvot mas'at binyamin, there is a responsa by a great rabbi called, the book called Mas'at Binyamin, that he said that shne simanim benoniyim, if you have two middle, not super, but still some type of marks, so that can be taken as siman muvak. So the Balatani have a discussion, a responsa, based on that because we said in the Gemara that in a ten lefi mishkelotah, so because the Gemara said that you can go by the weight, so why you don't say that here, if midat mishkal, the weight is something that's very hard to make a clear hashara, how weight is it, so that's maybe some type of distinguishing mark, and you have a big mahalach on that. You're welcome to read it by the very end of the Shulchan Aruch Harav and response to Kedushat Levi. Anyway, הוא אומר סימני הגט, והיא אומרת סימני הגט, יינתן לה. Here we have a situation that husband-wife, the husband said that the get that he wrote to divorce her, he lost it, but he says that he retrieved his notion of divorcing her, and therefore he never gave it to her, and she's not divorced. And he brings all the simanei get, all the distinguishing marks that was in that bill of divorce. The wife said it's not true. I received the get. He's already divorced me in that. And she also, omeret simanei get, she also brings the distinguishing mark of the bill of divorce, yinaten la. So the bill of divorce given to her. Why? Let's think together. Because if she never received it, how did she know all the simanei get, all the distinguishing mark in the bill of divorce? The husband for sure he know it because he wrote it. So even he said that he have all those marks, it's not the proof that he's the one who lost it. B'mai. So the Gemara asks, what exactly the distinguishing mark that we are referring here? If you tell me that we are talking about b'midat orko v'rochbo, that you give the length of the get, that's not a proof that she received it. Dilma b'hadei denakit le chazitei. Maybe she was standing there, she watched him, and therefore she figured out the measurement of the bill of divorce, even she never received it. So there is a Tosfot and others that have a discussion over there in Gittin and other places. The whole idea of en isha me'iza b'fnei ba'ala, all this notion that we discuss in Tractate Gittin, if it's applied here, because the situation, so the Tosfot hold that it can be a get mistovev. But anyway, the Gemara said, "Ela nekev yesh bo betzad od ploni." It was a special small hole next to one of the letters. So, in assumption that she cannot discover that, the Ritva explained that it's enough if she said she saw a hole, that is a hole there, not necessarily next to a certain letter. But anyway, hu omers another scenario, hu omers simanei achut. והיא אומרת סימני החוט יינתן לה. There is a special, a chut is like some type of, you can say line, you can say the one that we put together the get. So he brings the distinguishing mark of that, and she said it, so you give it her, otherwise how she know it? במאי. What exactly scenario אילמה בחברה ובסומכה? If you tell me that string, right, for example, it was given with a color of white or color of red, so what type of proof you have? Dilma ba, they dinakit lechazitei. Maybe she saw when he's about to give her. Ela b'midat orko. You have to say that is the length of that string, that she cannot figure out the length only if she hold it in her hand. Tosfot, Rabbi Peretz, and others have a lot to say on this, but here's the third scenario. הוא אומר בחפיסה והיא אומרת בחפיסה, יינתן לו. So here, again, depends if we go by the Tosfot Rabbi Peretz or not, but the scenario is that he claimed that the get is in the some type of small bag, and she said that it's in the hafisa, is like package bag. So he's getting it. My tama, the reason, medayad that she knows the kol ma, the itlay, that all his important documents and notes and other important materials that he has, that he owns, b'chafisahu demanachle, he puts it in that location, that bag or that drawer, that package. So the idea that she claimed that the get is in the chafisa, it's not a clear proof that that's the place that it's come out, because the Ritva explained she knows that the husband put the get over there. As we said, the Tosfot and the Peretz have a discussion over that. How do you know and what do you know? And there is a hard shaila, it's a hard question that Rabbi was asked. Was a fellow that lived together with a divorced woman for several years, and all of a sudden they have some quarrel, some fight, and she wants a get from him. He said that she never had a ketubah and she never present to him the get, and she just lived with him together, but she never divorced from the previous husband. She said that he's lying. She said that I show him maaseh bedin. As you know, the bedin turn the get and give her maaseh bedin. So, and she said that he tried to avoid it in order to get away from shalom bayit, or that he will not give her the ketubah, what he commit himself. The question is, did she have chezkat eshet ish or not? Because as long as she doesn't have a clear proof that she's divorcee, it's a very hard to determine, but he bring a big malach, based on our sugya, and now we're going to our Mishnah Kedosha. Now we're about to learn the Mishnah Kedosha. The question is, how long, Kamma zman hachrazat ha'aveda, for how long a person who discovered an item, valuable item, needs to go ahead and search for the owner. Ve'ad matai chayav le'achriz, how long the finder needs to go out and promulgate that he discovered a valuable item. First view, ad kedei she'yed'u bo shchenav divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said, until the neighbors will be aware of that. Rashi tells us that later the Gemara explained. Just give you a hint ahead, the Gemara said it depends on the Mekom Metziat Aveda, the exact location. So that's the view of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Shalosh Regalim. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, the location, as we said in the introduction, it was a location that's called Even HaToel B'Yerushalayim. It was a place that people come for lost and found. And during the three festivals, the Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, that's the time that most of the Israel go and ascend to Yerushalayim, based on what the Torah said in Book of Dvarim, chapter 16, verse 16, that it's obligation for people to go and ascend to Yerushalayim. So therefore, we go by the, Rabbi Yonatan said, the consecutive Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, and declared. Marshall added to that, and he said that for sure the assumption are the people goes there at least once in the 3 festivals. So therefore, the whole idea of what we learn in the Darim of Bal Te'acher, if someone commit himself to give an offering, we go by the cycle of the festivals. So therefore, we assume that it's just at least once of the 3 people will be there. And הרגל האחרון 7 ימים. And then after the last of the festival, needs to wait another period of 7 days, כדי שילך לביתו 3, ויחזור 3 ויחריז יום אחד. The idea is that it takes 3 days. Soon you see the difference between the first versus the second Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. But here we talk in a very general term, the first temple, that it's a 3 days period to go for a person in search for the lost item, and then return 3 days to Yerushalayim, and then the 7th day he go there and said, I lost certain valuable, brings, Rashi said, a certain distinguishing marks, and then can receive it. There is a difference here between Rashi and Tosfot. Tosfot on page 22b, and you see also in the Rambam, Ilchot Gzela V'Avela 13 said that that's the obligation on the one who discovered, the one who lost just give the distinguishing mark. The Khatam Sofer, the great Hungarian rabbi, said that based on this Maharshal and Gemara, nowadays you see here a derivative that a person needs to put the ad in the obviously befitting kosher newspaper for potential people that read those tools, so they'll be able to discover, especially in a certain location of people who are reading those. We go first by the Gemara of the view of Rabbi Meir. He said that until the neighbors are aware of the loss, Tana Shchenei Abeda, meaning people who are in the vicinity of the item that fellow discovered. Mai Shchenei Abeda, what exactly the meaning of that statement? Ilema Shchenim Deval Abeda, which means the neighbor, he doesn't know, the one who found it, he doesn't know who exactly is the owner. Iyadale, if he knew exactly who are the fellow who lost the item, leizul v'lehadar nihale, so let him go straight to the person who lost and give it to him. So it means that it's not the neighbor of the one who discovered the item, ela Rabbi Meir meant to say, shchenei makom shenimtzet bo aveida, the location, the exact location of that lost item was found, that's the place that the one who discovered it needs to go and announce that he, Rashi explained, maybe one of them lost it, but he doesn't have the obligation, Rashi and other tells us, to go and spread the word elsewhere. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer, second view in Rabbi Yehuda, what we learn, that you need to go by the 3 festivals, and then after the last one you need to wait another period of 7 days, 3 days, 3 days, 1 day. V'ramin this is Mishnah in Tractate Ta'anit, page 10, בשלושה במר חשוון שואלים את הגשמים. As we know, during the Amidah prayer, we have a bracha, Birkat Hashanim, and over there we add V'ten tal umatal livracha. Here he goes by the way in the famous Rashi in Tractate Ta'anit, page 4b, that said that the notion is that it's the 3rd day of Mar Cheshvan. We know that nowadays it's huge difference between the Israel and the diaspora. In Israel, as you know, it's the 7th of Cheshvan, in diaspora is December 5th, 6th, depends how you go. But anyway, so here, the beginning of beseeching the Almighty for the rain, during our Amidah prayer, V'ten tal u'matar libacha, it takes place when? The 3rd day of Mar Cheshvan. רבן גמליאל אומר, בשבעה בו, 15 יום אחר חג, כדי שירגיע האחרון שבארץ ישראל ינהר פרת. רבן גמליאל, and we know by now already that that's the halacha. Rabbi Gamliel said that we ask by the 7th day of the month of Mar Cheshvan, that if you count the days, it's actually 15 days after the completion of the festival of Sukkot, which is the Shmini Atzeret, the time that the last traveler, the pilgrims that come to Eretz Israel, go far away to Nehar Prat, that goes to the river, that it's the place before there is a rain. There always is concern that maybe such a heavy rain, and therefore they could not cross them. And you see it in Meiri, in Tanit 10, Rashi, and others that say that that's the concern. So it means that those pilgrims needs to go through a traveling of 15 days to their destination and not 3 days. So the question is, why Rabbi Yehuda gave the time only 3 days to go from his place in Yerushalayim to his house and back 3 days in 1 day? Why he goes like that? Now it's important to note, I know it's a little bit digressing, but it's important. Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who explained the Torah, the point of the, I think it's called Euphor River, Nehar Prat. So he said, Al Shem Ha'atid, that's speak about the future of Eretz Israel, and scholars believe that that's between Saudi Arabia and Persia, or modern days they call Iran. So the Ritva, and you see in the Piskei Chazon Ish based on that, the Gemara and Gittin have a discussion what exactly the meaning of Nehar Prat. And as we said, the Chazon Ish have a big mahalach over this Ramban, what is the meaning of the Euphorian, the Nehar Prat, and implication of halacha. But anyway, Rav Yosef responds and said, Amar Rav Yosef lo kasha, it's not a question. Kan, here in the Mishnah, in Tractate Ta'anit, they are speaking in the season of the rain, Be Mikdash Rishon, speaking about the season, the era of the first temple. Kan, in our Mishnah, Be Mikdash Sheni, the second temple. Be Mikdash Rishon, Din Fishei Yisrael Tuva. In the first temple, it was a large amount of people that ascend the Chtiv Behu, because in the first book of Kings, chapter 4, they said, Yehuda v'Yisrael rabim kachol asher al hayam larov. The nation of Judah and Israel were abundant, like they use a figurative sense, like the sand on the sea, be'inan kulei hai. So therefore there is a need of period, because there are so many, of 15 days in order to go to their faraway location, versus the Mikdash Sheni, the Lon Fishei Israel Tuva, because unfortunately during the era of the second temple, based on the book of Nehemiah chapter 7, דכתיב בהו כל הקהל כאחד 4,350. The whole account of people was much smaller in comparison to the first temple. Lo be'inan kulei hai. You do not need a travel time for such a long distance, since there are relatively few, and therefore the assumption is that those people live close to Yerushalayim. Abaye responded to Rabbi Yosef and he said, "V'haktiv." If you look in the book of Ezra, chapter 2, verse 70, they speak about those who ascend from Babylon to Eretz Israel. It's written, quote, "Vayishvu הכהנים והלוויים וגומר והמשוררים והשוערים וכל ישראל בעריהם." The book of Ezra speaks about the nation of Israel, that even they are few, they are scattered in all different locations, and they are distant from Yerushalayim as it was earlier. So it means that even the era of the second temple, the distance between the temple in Yerushalayim and their home, it's 15 days and not 3 days. So the Gemara said, who, since those who made Aliyah, those who ascend from Babylon to Eretz Yisrael were relatively few, in those early occupied city in the era of the first temple, Ipcha mistabra. It's more makes sense to go by the reverse order of understanding. Mikdash Rishon at the era of the first temple, Din Flishe Israel Tuva, because it was so many people, Di Tzavat Alma, because there are people, Rashi said Tzevet, there's like team, group of people go and in group and go together and ascend. So therefore, so because there's a lot of traffic, it was those travelers that goes both during the day and the evening time. Since it was those who travel at night, lo be'inan kulei hai, they don't need so much time to count. V'sagei bitlata yoma, so it's enough to go by 3 days. Tosfot challenger, but anyway, versus Mikdash Sheni, versus the era of the second temple, the lo nefishet Israel tuva, because it wasn't too many people that ascend in comparison to the first one. The lo netzavat alma, and it wasn't a group of people that traveled together in the kind of pool together. ולא משתכחי שיירת דאז לבין מיממה בלילה בעינן קולעי. It wasn't those caravans, those travelers that travel in both during the day and at night, so they need 15 days, much longer time, in order to reach their destination, their homes. So the great Rav of Lodz, in his book called Piskei Tshuvot, he asked, based on that, a serious halachic question, since you tell me that they are all ascend to Yerushalayim and they have their part, you go by the property that they inherited, or you go by the properties that everyone get there. Because remember, based on that, you can say that those who ascend, who came back, you see a vacant land, and people just take it. Or you have a land that it was just go by the perpetuity of inheritance. So the Rabbi Yaakov Meir, the one who was the son-in-law of the Sfat Emet and wrote the Hagahot on Sfat Emet, he argued and said that this is the indirect source, that each person returned to his inherited location, because they are scattered after the destruction of the first temple, but they have, in a sense, the tradition and they have the way, so they return to the land that they originally inherited. Tosfot over there asked, if it was a small group of travelers that goes in the pulling, so it should be 6 days, it should not be 15 days. You see it here in Tosfot 2, וסגי בתלת היום ואם תאמר דזין ימים ומחצה דהיינו חצי של יום תדבב יום. So Tosfot argued that it was 6, not 15 days. And he basically argued that you cannot sleep at night, and therefore the Beit HaMikdash Rishon, the first temple, is 3 days, and the second one 15 days. Anyway, Rava Amar, another option, לא שנה במקדש ראשון ולא שנה במקדש שני. It makes no difference if it was the season, the era of the first temple or the second temple. The sages gave a person 3 days each way to go to his house. And you see that notion in several occasions, that the rabbis, even you can argue and say that one who discovered a lost item have a biblical obligation to return it, but most of the people, when they lost some item, they, Nachlat Moshe said, they usually just give up hope in despair, and even you argue and say that most of the people live close to Yerushalayim, it means that question is if the person hear about it the first festival or not, or second one. Anyway, the key is that the rabbis do not want to impose more than 7 days, which is 3 plus 3 plus 1. The late Rav Karelitz, the Chazon Ish, and also the Brisker Rav have a big malach over this. The whole idea of observing 2 days Yom Tov, that we know it only applies in the diaspora, based on the discussion now of Gemara. Anyway, we should have more time. Okay, Amar Ravina. So, because we have this quandary of the view of Rabbi Yehuda, Ravina said, Shema Mina, we derive from here that since Rabbi Yehuda gave the one who lost the item only 6 days to go to his house and then return to Yerushalayim, and not more time to search in his entire home, Ki Machriz, when one who declared that he discovered an estate, Glima Machriz, he's not just said, I found something. He said, I found a certain garment. The Isakaratach the Tamachris, but if you tell me, I just found something and didn't go to a specification what exactly involved, so you need to add logically another day in order for a person to search in his house because he doesn't know what. Rashi said, and we know that when it's repeated the statement twice in the Gemara, in the style of Gemara, it means that that's the final decision, which is it needs to say in a very general sense, in this case, I found a garment, I found a piece of clothing. Rava disagreed and said, even he just said, I found something, and without going to details, as we said earlier, the rabbis did not want to impose more than 7 days period in order for a person to go and to all this notion of back and forth. תנו רבנן רגל ראשון אומר רגל ראשון, רגל שני אומר רגל שני, רגל שלישי אומר סתם. So we here differentiate between the first festival, second festival versus the third one. He just said, I discovered something I found, and in order to make sure that one who lost doesn't know that that's the last chance and you have only 7 days. What's the big deal to say it's the third festival? So which means that one who lost the item knew that that's the last chance. In order to avoid confusion, that the one who lost the item not confused between the third and the second, and he knows that Maramshif and Rashi said that want to avoid also the one declared not mix between the two. Shani Nami. So Gemara asks that you should do the same at the second festival. Page 28b. Atiyah lachlufa berishon. The same way that he can mix with the first festival, and he thinks that there's another 2 chances. There are people like that wait for the last moment. So they said haka'at regel shlishi. Rabbi Moshe Weisblum and others said that in addition to announcing the local shuls, based on this Gemara, Rabbi Moshe Weisblum discuss how ad Kamma chiyuv, how far a person needs to go and how far a person needs to announce. תלמוד רבנן בראשונה כל מי שמצא ודאי מכריז עליה 3 רגלים, באחר רגל אחרון 7 ימים. So originally it was the 3 festivals, and then after that was 7 days period, כדי שילך 3 ויחזור 3 ויכריז יום אחד, as we explained earlier. מי שחרב בית המקדש ייבנה במהרה בימינו, from the time the temple that please God will be rebuilt soon. חתם סופר said that we said in תהילים כי 1000 שנים בעיניך כי יום אתמול, כי יעבור צלע. So they said, בבני ירושלים עיר הקודש במהרה בימינו. So התקינו שיהיו מכריזים בתי כנסיות ובתי מדרשות, and that's the שולחן אורך rules in 267, Prisha said it only one time and not three, but anyway, they said that's the time that they need to announce. משרבו האנסים, התקינו שיהיו מודיעים לשכניו ומיודעיו ודיו. מה עם שרבו האנסים? דאמרי עבדת על מלכה. Unfortunately, there are people who are traders and others, anyone who discover a lost item, they said, oh, that belongs to the king. Rabbi Yomi Ashkach Udia de Dinrei. Rabbi Yomi discovered a vessel full of gold coins. Chaziahu barnash dekam miltat. So a person passed by that, some said baroma, אמר להזיל שכל לנפשך, דלת פרסה דאמרי עבדת על מלכה. That I'm not a Persian that say that every lost item belongs to the kingdom. We should finally have a discussion if we always go by Dina de Malchut Adina or not, based on this Gemara. Ten Rabbanan, even to end, as we said in the introduction, that the To'en meaning To'anim or To'im, which means that that's the location that people, Aita, Yerushalayim, people come and declare they found, and other try to find their lost item. כל מי שעבדה לו עבדה, anyone who lost, נפנה לשם, go there, וכל מי שמוצא עבדה, נפנה לשם, זה עומד ומכריז, one stand on that stone and declare that he discovered an item, וזה עומד ונותן סימנים ונוטליים, the other one brings the marks, distinguishing marker, וזוהי ששנים נוספו והוא נמחת אבן הטוען. That's the famous Gemara that speak about Mishnah, Gemara in the Ta'anit, page 19, Chonia Ma'agel, with the tremendous need of rain. So that's they want to examine to see if the rain stops, so they want to see if Eben HaTohen was covered. There are those who say that the late Rabbi Shmuel Salanter, that's how he has in the Kabbalah, in the tradition, the exact location of Eben HaTohen. There are some say that on his gravestone, put part of that stone of Eben HaTohen. Anyway, Mishnah Gdosha. After we declare the law of Hachraza, the proclamation, now we speak about the one who claimed that he's the owner. Mishnah Gdosha, Amar et ha'aveda velo amar simanea. More later expand on that. Lo yiten, lo. Not given. V'haramai, if that person knows a untruthful and scrupulous individual, even in bringing distinguishing mark, you should not return to that fellow. שנאמר, the Torah said in Dvarim, chapter 22, verse 2, והיה עמך הדרוש אחיך אותו, עד שתדרוש את אחיך אם רמאי או אינו רמאי, which means that you have to make sure that that fellow is not fooling you. There's a disputation among the early rabbis if that person, a scrupulous individual, give a distinguishing mark if you return. It's clear, most of the rabbis said, if you have witnesses, then you have to return it to him. Rav Yehuda said that he just said that I found an item. Versus Rav Nachman said you need to go specification. He said I found a garment. Rav Yehuda, we have this concern just mentioned of someone who's not truthful. Rav Nachman אם כן, אין לדבר סוף. Rashi and Ritva and others said that in conclusion we should give a very general title, but the only problem is that there are too many cases of people who are not truthful, then they have to make a decision how to go about with this. But anyway, תנן אמר את העבדה ולא אמר את סימניה, הרי זה לא ייתן לו. If you just said the item you lost, that doesn't give a distinguishing mark, you don't return it. אמר בשלמה ואתה מכריז כמה שמונה, אף על גב לאמר גלימה, כאילו אמר סימנים לא מהדרינן לי, אלא אמר גלימה מכריז, אמר אי הוא גלימה, ואמר אי הוא גלימה, צריכה למימה, כאילו אמר סימנים לא מהדרינן לי. אמר רב ספרא לעולם גלימה מכריז, אמר אי הוא גלימה, ואמר אי הוא סימנים. So here the explanation is that basically Rav Safra said that it is a statement that he discovered the garment, the glima, and what the Mishnah stated and said that the one who Motze found that said glima, a garment, and the other fellow, the one who claimed that he owns, he bring a simanim, a distinguishing mark, it means umay lo amar simanea, lo amar simanim mubhakim dida. So he just said the color of the garment, doesn't give the specification. So the argument is, to spot tell us in 27b and others, you see Marsham and Rashba and Rosh, it doesn't need to be a super distinguishing mark. It's called simanim tovim, something that it's clear, you know what he's talking about. Aramaic, someone who's known as unscrupulous or person who's dishonest, you will not return it. Even if you bring the distinguishing mark. Originally, someone lost an item, someone found it, you give the distinguishing mark and return it. Unfortunately, it's too many people who are dishonest. So the rabbi said, they have to say, the one who declared that he lost an item, bring 2 witnesses, prove that you are the owner of that property, and then and take it. Now the big question, what does that mean, the Rav Ma'ihu? But anyway, so the father of Rav Papa lost donkey, which is very valuable in those days, and they discovered it. So here we're speaking about bringing witnesses that you are not unscrupulous. Atal is decided, so he brought witnesses. Amalu, do you know that he is unscrupulous? We know. You consider me someone who's untruthful. Which means the opposite way, that we are declared that you are not unscrupulous. So they said, meaning they didn't understand the question clearly. Mistabra, logically, what we understand, person doesn't bring to himself something so negative. So when Rav Papa's father brought these witnesses to the Bet Din, he was sure that they're not going to testify something that's against him. The Ritva asked, we have this concept of toch kedei dibur. So toch kedei dibur, you can lachzor bo, a person can change. So he said that it's only the question is if the person is under great pressure, and the definition of Ramai, you see more on that obviously in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Code of Jewish Law.